Hello there guys and welcome back to the channel. Right, so it is December time, so it's time to do our twice yearly champion rankings that we already have started. We went over all of the 10 buffs in 2022, significantly less than the year before, and we started with 2022 champion rankings. Now, obvious mandatory disclaimer, with these rankings I am not trying to insult your family's honor. We all perceive and experience and play the game differently. Some of the champions or game modes or interactions that are important to me will not be important to you. I typically tend to look at my own personal experience and mainly the current game trends where we see these champions being used, because ultimately, if there is a will, there is a way, and we have seen this plenty of times. You can do, I don't know, more than most of the fights in this game totality with the worst champions in game. If you're dedicated enough, it's going to be harder, you're going to be having to take longer time, but it's doable. And that's why, just because a champion can do something doesn't necessarily mean it's meant to do those things or it's best at it. And ultimately, to me, champions find their value and gain their value in more competitive aspects of the game, because if these champions are good enough and effective enough to be used in Alliance War, to be used in Battlegrounds, to be used in Alliance Quest, in scenarios where the consequence of not getting that fight done matters, then these champions are the more valuable ones. We're not necessarily focusing as much on story content, but we are still taking that in consideration, just like we are challenge modes, like Grandmaster's Gauntlet and Abyss, and that type of stuff. So ultimately, the champion will be higher on these lists if we see it more often in top-tier Alliance Wars, Battlegrounds, hardest, Eternity of Pain fights, Grandmaster Gauntlet, stuff like that. And therefore, the initial part of this list went from Captain Britain to Shuri to Sam Wilson, Wong, Sauron, Attuma, Misty Knight, Toad, Gore, Spider Supreme, and Wiccan. If you do want to find full commentary on their placements, check out the previous video released in this series. I hope I explained myself quite well. One champion that I did see quite a few comments was Sam Wilson, and I do agree that Sam Wilson, in his reality and theory, is capable of doing more than Sauron or Misty Knight. He has more abilities, there are more applications to them, but at the same time, less people are using Sam Wilson to do those things. Why? Because it is harder to do, because it often is not the best option, or there are better alternatives, because the combination of the increased difficulty in his playstyle and timer watching and the requirements are just often not necessarily worth the squeeze, comparatively speaking. But I can absolutely agree why they are die-hard Sam Wilson fans and they feel that he should be higher. And again, as the time changes, as the meta changes, as the uses of these champions, incline or decline, he might end up being higher. There are champions that rose in their stock drastically with the addition of Battlegrounds. There are champions that raise in their ranks immediately with new Alliance War metas and stuff like that. So ultimately, with new content comes new needs for the players, and if Sam Wilson will be doing a good job to fulfilling those needs of the players, then he's obviously going to move up higher. I'm absolutely not saying that, he's an awful champion or anything like that. In fact, 2022 was amazing year for the champions. We didn't have a single champion that's, a purgatory or a super scroll or something of the sort. Even the lower ranked champions have their place, have their uses, have their unique, interesting bits of utility and viability. So there's, plenty of reason for players to potentially rank them up and utilize them if those champions do fulfill whatever, or do solve whatever problems these players are looking to solve. That being said, it's time to look at the more successful champions of 2022. Again, a disclaimer, we are not going to be ranking Jessica Jones as an exclusive champion that will not be entering the basic pool, and we will not be ranking Mantis as she's barely out. There is, absolutely no certainty where she would end up. I am quite confident that she would at the very least reach mid-section of this list, but potentially higher. I don't think she would be at the bottom end. but all of that is purely speculative at this point. So we need to start with spot number 11. And I will ask every single one of you to remember that all of these champions are amazing. Like, all of them are worth ranking up. In fact, I believe that I personally have ranked up every single one of these champions. And most of the champions even that I placed lower in the list that have come out this year. But definitely every single one of the champions that I'm going to mention I have taken at the very least to rank 3. I utilize them frequently and I find a lot of use and value for them, which is again just a testament of how good 2022 has been overall for the release of these champions. But we're going to have to start with Black Cat. Black Cat's getting spot number 11, and I'll try my best to explain that. I know a lot of people are going to be upset about it because she's phenomenal and she's amazing, and so are virtually all of the champions ahead in this list here. The reason why Black Cat initially didn't take off is the fact that she was one of the bigger tragedy stories of an absolute garbage marketing upon her release. All of the initial content that was created pretty much solely or largely focused on her beating a world record in Labyrinth of Legends or doing a boss fight in 3 minutes or some crap like that. And the reality is, nobody cares. Like, nobody really gives a shit about that in 2022, because most of the people who will explore Abyss, already have, or they at the very least do not overly focus on it. And Abyss rewards at the moment, are not necessarily worth the squeeze comparatively speaking when we have Act 7 in the game and, a bunch of other game modes. And on top of that, it is one and done content. Aegon is typically the champion, and most people, I need him for Abyss, I'm going to rack him up. And other than that, one and done contents without repeated use, or at the very least without repeated use appeal, typically do not spark the interest. And when Black Cat got released, she definitely got kind of like overlooked immediately, and that was a very large reason for it. In fact, in my personal case, I overlooked her as well, and it was only after I saw, I believe, Fintech start destroying Battlegrounds fights with Black Cat that I kind of started paying more attention to this champion, and I recognized her full potential, or close to it anyways. And at that point, obviously, she made some people's jaws drop, because it turns out that for all of her weaknesses, she does serve as an amazing answer to plenty of problem fights in exactly that type of content. She deals with like halflings, rintrats, man-things, and Sasquatches and whatnot, and she's absolutely amazing. That being said, obviously she's not necessarily the most well-rounded champion. She is competing for attention in a very, very hard stacked category, which is effectively glass cannons, or high damage utility offense only champions in a sense. She has very little going on for her defensively. There's only like a little bit of evade on intercepts if she's awakened. Other than that, she has virtually no defensive potential at all, and also relatively small health pool and quite squishy. So with that, obviously, she's pretty much 98% offensive character, and that immediately, complicates champions to be kind of like wildly valued in many cases by the, most competitive gamers out there. At the same time, she does her job well enough to still steal the catalyst from other champions and do place herself in the discussion of, potential best options for plenty of counters and things like that. The other kind of like downside of Black Cat is that she does effectively function slightly as a ramp-up character, where the damage output on her short fights is entirely basically dependent on your crit RNG on your level 2. You do kind of take the controls in the longer fights, where improving your combo meter higher improves your critical chance as well, and that helps a lot to get much more guaranteed damage in somewhat medium to longer fights. But in short fights, it does highly depend on your crit RNG. And then on top of that, obviously her ability accuracy reduction is also a ramp up mechanic, basically, where you start with very little to no ability accuracy reduction, and there are fights where that just isn't fast enough. There are fights, for instance, that Falcon will be able to do and come out with full health that Black Cat won't, and that is because she doesn't get that ability accuracy reduction immediately. But that being said, obviously, once she gets going, she's absolutely phenomenal, and there's absolutely nothing not to like about the character. And I do think that she's extremely successful addition to the contest. She does exactly what she's designed to do. She can take a ton of problem fights, and I do think we can see more and more of her in future, because ability accuracy reduction reliably is a very powerful mechanic in combination with her damage output. Definitely does put her in the higher half of this year's champions, in my opinion. Moving on to the next one, and that is going to be Titania. And Titania's main appeal at the moment, at the very least in my personal opinion, looking at it extremely cynically, is the fact that she is by far the fastest and highest damage output champion from the buff immune category. Now, we do have Ant-Man, Spider-Man 2099, Red Guardian. We have a couple of pseudo buff immune champions that basically, you know, ignore their own dexterity buff, like Quicksilver and Shuri. And virtually out of all of those, she's the one that's the best suited for short to medium fights because of her faster ramp up. Now, obviously, there is more utility to be spoken of in Alliance War. Obviously, the ramp up doesn't matter as much, for instance, which is still the reason why I do think that overall Spider-Man 2099, for instance, is the better Alliance War champion. But in game modes like Battlegrounds, obviously it matters a ton. And whether people like to admit it or not, Spider-Man 2099, as good as he is and as amazing control as he can have over the fight, is just not good enough when it comes to Battlegrounds. To put it in perspective, I will have absolutely no reservations on slapping down a Man-Thing on defense, seeing that opponent has Spider-Man 2099 to deal with that Man-Thing perfectly, with, you know, being buff immune, absolutely not having any worries about MD because he has with their mechanics and stuff like that, because I just know that he's going to have to take considerable amount of time trying to kill that Man-Thing, and I'll likely be able to outspeed pretty much any other matchup that I have to do. And those are kind of like the realities of the competitive game. So Titania is ultimately at the moment the best, well, buff immune champion, or the highest damage buff immune champion for short to medium fights, in my opinion. And then additionally, the amount of utility that you can squeeze out of her haymakers is quite impressive. You can use that to tank level 3s quite easily. On top of it, obviously, her access to a plethora of debuffs is extremely helpful, because it interacts extremely well with masteries like Inequity and also Despair, reducing opponents' healing. Subtle reduction in opponents' combat power rate is helpful in her being able to be more aggressive. Ultimately, I do wish they gave her slightly bit more utility. I do wish that we could see something like Slow and Petrify in her, you know, earlier kit. We do see the Petrify and whole plethora of the buffs at level debuffs on the level 3, which is basically a cartoon level of debuffs. But ultimately, I do think she's a champion that still was a little bit reserved when Kabam created, but ultimately came out successful enough to kind of like elevate her to the higher end of the science class. And I love her. I think she's amazing. I think, you know, we need to look at these champions for what they are, and forgive them their shortcomings if they do their intended purpose well enough, and that is who Titania is to me. She is the higher damage output champion that's buff immune, with also, you know, meaningful amounts of utility. We're not going to pretend that, you know, ability to apply weakness debuffs or debilitate debuff or suppression debuff is a game changer in, you know, every game mode, because it's not. There could have been, you know, more impactful debuffs. But at the same time, I do think that she's about good enough. At the same time, I do worry for Titania in like a year or two from now, unlike with many of the other champions on the list, if we do get somebody that's, you know, faster and more effective, also buff immune, or, you know, better at what she does. But I suppose there's a danger for virtually any champion. That being said, Titania, I think, is a solid 10 spot for 2022 champions. And we are going to move on to spot number 9. And spot number 9 is going to go to Valkyrie. Now, Valkyrie is another champion that took a bit of a while to kind of like get into her own groove. I do think that her rise to current popularity is largely a result of excellent timing with current Battlegrounds victory track and friendly meta being Rich Get Richer, which obviously did help to escalate her to even, you know, bigger heights in Battlegrounds. Ultimately, I do think still Massacre, for many reasons, is better champion in most of the game modes. because both of them have a ton of similarities, and Massacre is the faster one in generic situations. He does ramp up quicker, he does have access to dots and, more effective ability accuracy reduction. But there is a redeeming game mode for Titania. There are also redeeming abilities, such as ability to completely ignore Unstoppable, which is still something that we're trying to get used to properly, because it is quite bonkers. And with Titania, I do think that people are currently mis-evaluating her slightly. I don't think she is going to be as good for Battlegrounds, ultimately in every meta as people think she is. I do think when it comes specifically to Battlegrounds, then Massacre is definitely the better alternative. At the same time, I do think that for Alliance War, she's going to be one of the more impactful champions released this year, and that is extremely important, because she can confidently do the matchups without touching opponent a single time, thus bypassing a whole plethora of nodes and abilities. And yes, without the support of Rich Get Richer, it does take longer, so you will spend more time dancing about, hitting opponent's block, building up to your level 2 before you're able to fully, do a nice amount of damage. But it is going to be safer. It is one of the safer options for a ton of problem fights already, and I fully expect for that to carry on in the future metas. I do, in a ways, look at her somewhat as a discount Quake, where with a reasonable amount of skill and confidence in the character, you will be able to take an absolute boatload of fights you were never necessarily intended to be able to take with her. And that is something that we will definitely look for in the future, but there are plenty of examples of it even right now, where in tricky situations she has proven herself to be an absolutely amazing counter to difficult hazard shift fights, and so on and so forth. So, I am placing Valkyrie at the moment in 9th. I do think her status in Battlegrounds ultimately eventually will go down. I do, however, think her status in Alliance War is only going to go up, and we're going to see more of Valkyrie in the future iterations of Alliance War seasons. So that's kind of my prediction, but overall, I do think she's a well-balanced champion with solid kit of utility, with a relatively high skill cap, but something that is accessible to larger audience and player base, nothing like, Tiger, let's say, or a bunch of other champions. And it works. So that's why we do have Valkyrie in spot number 9. Let's move on to spot number 8. And spot number 8 is a bit of a leap of faith. It is Spot. And the thing with Spot is he's one of those champions where we can't be entirely certain of how well he's going to do, because he's not in the current featured 6-star. We still need to wait about 2 months for him to be widely available to the majority of the competitive player base. Therefore, he will absolutely not be represented in terms of popularity in Battlegrounds and Alliance and stuff like that, only because, majority of the people don't have him as a 6-star in these competitive game modes. At the same time, judging based on what he can do and what he will do, I fully expect him to be incredibly popular. He is one of the faster science nuke type of champions, or basically get to level 2 and job is done. He has creative deliveries of damage, and ultimately, enough utility. And also, unlike somebody like Black Cat, for instance, he does have more defensive potential, where he can be problematic on defense, especially, whilst people learn his animations, which can be tricky, and his abilities and things like that. But even in the longer term, I do think that when fighting against a fairly stacked Spot, he's a type of champion where you will want to have a decently good counter, otherwise the fight isn't going to go too fast or too great. That being said, some of the footage that we have been seeing from Spot, from the lucky people that do have him, has been absolutely impressive. I do think that he's going to do great things. I expect great things from him. And this is at the moment where I am going to place him. Again, this is speculative placement. This is me taking a bit of a leap of faith and basing my decision on smaller amount of information and that's available for, let's say, Valkyrie or a bunch of other champions. But I have seen enough to know that there will definitely be value in his kit. So I'm giving spot. I'm giving spot number right now. Okay. Let's move on to spot number 7. And spot number 7, this is where it gets spicy, because every single one of these champions, in the mind of some players, is likely going to be the best champions released this year. And in spot number 7, at the moment, I'm going to be putting in iDoom. And iDoom is great champion. Absolutely, without a doubt. I think the biggest problem with iDoom is the fact that he will end up living in his big brother's shadow. Or I do think that ultimately, all things considered, OG Doom is the more powerful champion. For mid to longer length fights especially. I do think that they do quite many things similarly, and I think we are doing this champion disservice in discussing him all the time in comparison or in relation with OG Doom. But let's discuss him as a tech champion instead. He is able to incorporate virtually all of the tech staples, with access to shock, access to armor or buff, with some form of power control, with ability not to crit, and all of that stuff. All of that is a good base kit of utility to have. Kabam hasn't been as generous with the stats as they could have been, but he does have decently okayish damage for the medium length fights. I do think that that is one of his weaker type of sides, where he does have a kind of like an ideal fight duration, where his damage output is respectable, but ultimately in shorter to medium level fights, his damage output is not unworkable, but it's far from insane, impressive, amazing, let's be. So he's not a rocket, he's not a nuke type of champion, which is fine. He's definitely a utility type of champion with amazing power control. There are some things that obviously make him more formidable as well as a defender, including his, potential to go with unblockable special attacks and his ability to power lock the opponent just before he would get KO'd, especially when he's awakened whilst healing. And there's a ton of abilities, that make him moderately good in defense, with also quite few obvious counters, like anything that gets rid of his armor buff, anything that has ton of buffs himself, anything shock immune. So ultimately, I do think he's a solid champion. I don't think he's, top of the top. I do think we will see much more of him as more people get him, because he's in the same boat as Spot, where he is not in the current sector featured crystal. But he, at the same time, I think is a bit more balanced, and in a way where he's a decently good defender, he's a decently good attacker, he exerts great amount of control over fights. There are things, again, that I wish they made better about him or different. For instance, his ability to get rid of opponents' prowesses only work against a handful of champions or in a handful of situations. And his level 1 with his opponent being just special locked without exerting any other different type of power control there does seem like a bit of a slower option, so to say. The fact that you can just go to level 2, however, and start power control and power burning is quite nice. Ultimately, I do think that much of this champion's ranking still kind of hangs up in the air, but also, even if not for the fact that he's one of the highest prestige, or is the highest prestige champion in the game right now, we'll definitely make sure that we see this guy, because if you take this guy all the way up to rank 4, you're gonna try to get as much use out of him. So we will see exactly how well he performs when he does enter the new featured crystal and more people acquire him. But meanwhile, I do think of him and feel of him and as a good champion, as a solid, stable, balanced, with definite, great piece of utility, with obvious weaknesses as well. But let's see how he performs going further. There is, again, just like with Spot in a way, there's still quite a lot to be seen from him. The next champion, again, is to many people the favorite. Many people hate this champion, definitely, and that is Quicksilver. Now, Quicksilver is one of those champions that does ask you to get used to him really badly. Like, the amount of his combos, the amount of hits on his combos and the way you have to throw his combos, and then the rest of the ability kit that you need to incorporate does take quite a bit of getting yourself accustomed to his kit. That being said, ultimately, assuming that everybody is willing and able to get on with the program and to learn how to use him to his fullest, how well is he going to be doing? Well, Quicksilver at the moment is enjoying more defensive ranking than he deserves. Like many new champions, when they come out, it takes a while for the community at large to be comfortable fighting these champions on defense with less than ideal counters. And Quicksilver is still in that position where, unless you have like a Kingpin or a Mole Man or something very specific to get him down, he will present problems on defense, which is why we see as much of him in Battlegrounds. Offensively, he's workable, he's serviceable for Battlegrounds length type of fight and content, but he's definitely far from the fastest because he is a ramp-up burst damage type of champion. So, in Battlegrounds, I do think that over time his popularity is going to fade. I do think there will be metas where he's going to be good or great for. I do think there will be plenty of metas where even when most people have this champion, they will not necessarily choose to run him. That being said, I do think that he has a lot of utility that best shines outside of the Battlegrounds or Alliance quest, that best shines in Alliance War, or potentially in story content, or potentially of the troublesome challenge type of fights. Because he's able to burst down a ridiculous amount of health pools if you build him up correctly. He does have incredible amount of utility in his kit. With his, big whiplash burst, with his access to wither, with him not having a single buff on his base kit and able to basically switch off his dexterity precision, with him being able to bypass miss and bypass unstoppable and bypass evade, with that, him able to evade special attacks other champions cannot evade. There is a lot in his kit and all of it has value. But all of it only has value for as long as this champion has content and home where to go to be used. And again, I do think that in one of the more competitive game modes like Battlegrounds, eventually he's not going to be necessarily as popular as he is right now, as people learn to take him down better. And then, he would have to be worthwhile attacker to keep in your deck, and there are better science options in a limited 30 champion deck space for that game mode. But I do think we will see more of him in Alliance War for plenty of trouble fights. I do think he's going to be, amazing answer for, let's say, future iterations of Eternity of Pain. I do think he's going to be amazing answer for future iterations of Grandmaster Gauntlet and things like that. So, definitely an amazing and valuable champion who is what he was made to be. He's ironically being a speedster, not a sprinter in this game. He's not a short burst amount of champion, which is one of the funnier things that I do find about Quicksilver, where I understand what they went for when they gave him like a 13-14 hit combo, but it is ironic that it takes double the amount of time to land a standard combo with this guy than it takes to land with any other champion in the game. And therefore, by definition, it pretty much takes double the amount of time, or almost double the amount of time, to build him up to, let's say, a level 2, which is a big part of his problem. If he could throw his combos at the same speed that anybody else does, he would be much, much more viable in short-term content. But that is such a huge slog on his fight time that, again, ironically, Quicksilver is suffering from a lack of speed when it comes to throwing his combo. But they made him the way they did. I can understand why they did it. And I still think he's a great champion. I still think there's a lot that he can do for players. Spot number 5. Press the wrong button there. Spot number 5 at the moment is going to go to Omega Sentinel. I think Omega Sentinel is awesome. I think Omega Sentinel, again, is an absolute utility machine. The biggest complaint people have about Omega Sentinel is the difficulty to manage her debuffs and keep it on and keep the fight under control. And I do think that Omega Sentinel would have been even more impressive if they just gave her a smidge of power control. If they gave her a line where when you refresh or pause your non-damaging debuffs, you power drain 0.01% of opponent's power, for instance, or something like that. And she would be much, much more powerful. As she is, however, she is an absolute mutant destroyer, but she's also extremely capable in different matchups. With that being said, I think she has proven her worth in virtually every necessary area of the game. She has been used as a de facto best counter for a variety of Eternity of Pain fights. She is a staple in most of the Battlegrounds decks. She is seeing a lot of presence in Alliance Wars, offensively and defensively. She is being used for story content, and she does it all, basically. She's extremely versatile. There are obvious weaknesses with her, she has this duality of tankiness and fragility, where she has access to huge amounts of energy resistance and huge amounts of armor, which can let her tank, a ton of hits to the block and stuff like that. But by having a tiny health pool, if there's a crit that gets through or some burst of damage, that quickly will whittle her down. So I do kind of like that. She's a massively tanky champion, but also somewhat of a fragile champion simultaneously. Talk about, Schrodinger's armor, I suppose. And moving forward, obviously, again, all of the bits of utility, ability to bypass miss, immunity to nullify as a tech champion goes a long way in her usability, enabling her to be extremely viable option against a ton of tech champions and against a ton of mystic champions, and take a bunch of different nodes. The fact that her Incinerate switches to Plasma, thus dealing better, with more mutants, because hardly anybody is immune to the Plasma, if anything at all, there in mutant class. And access to heal block and everything else. It is a champion that requires you to getting used to and getting comfortable with. I do think majority of the people who have yet to recognize her potential and still complain about the difficulty of managing debuffs on the opponent are doing so because they are too greedy. People who try to do too much with the Mega Sentinel typically are the people who try to struggle the most. People try to get the 3 non-damaging debuffs and then start stacking more Incinerates an opponent by the time you reach level 2, for instance, which is absolutely unnecessary. I think with Omega Sentinel, one of the things is that the less you kind of focus on it and the less attention you pay to the fight itself rather than the exact situation of the debuffs, in majority of the situations, the better and easier it is to use her. You don't need to get, an extra Incinerate before you throw level 2. Just make sure you have 2-3 debuffs by the time you throw level 2. Damage can be fine. And one cool thing that I do like about Omega Sentinel is that she has pretty much the highest attack rating in the game on her base. So she synergizes extremely well with Liquid Courage Double Edge, because she de facto gets the biggest attack increase, because it's based obviously as a percentage of her base attack, and she has a huge amount of base attack. That's quite awesome. Amazing champion, and definitely has been seen already as conquering all of the game modes at the most competitive level. Let's move on to spot number 4. And spot number 4, I'm going to put Scorpion. I do think that eventually I might move him even higher up. I do think that potentially I am slightly underestimating him, because at the same time I think Scorpion's absolutely bonkers, crazy, and amazing. I do, and all of the champions in this top 5 are. I do think Scorpion has the utility that Science Class kind of needed, in a sense, where he does have access to 3 different immunities, to 3 different damage over time effects. He can deliver his damage as bursts. He has access to ever so needed Petrify, and therefore also, in the context of Battlegrounds and Alliance War, he can use it to heal himself up, which is quite important. And then on top of it, he can block unblockable attacks when awakened, and has access to Taunt, which is super helpful with this type of champion. And then obviously we have the second side of Scorpion, where if you give him a synergy, you can exert insane amounts of damage out from him, and he can be extremely viable in longer form content as well. So ultimately, I do think Scorpion is one of the better examples of a well-balanced utility knife type of champion that, can switch from being a reasonably high damage output champion to being incredibly high damage output champion with addition of a single synergy. I do think that one of the best things about Scorpion is, in all of the competitive content, he can be one of the most Liquid Courage Double Edge friendly champions, because you can easily make him poison immune, you can easily counter the recoil damage that you would take with your level 2 in Alliance War and in Battlegrounds or against any champion that regens. And I do think he's amazing. I do think a lot of people like to kind of like compare or discuss Quicksilver and Scorpion, and as a champion in their base function, I do think Scorpion's better. Quicksilver might do slightly more, but Scorpion does the things better, faster, and I think that is why he functions better. Because remember, you don't need to do everything to be a great champion. Many of the best champions have very few abilities. Like Ghost, effectively has just evade, counter, crit, and phase. Like, Quake, only thing she did is placed concussions on opponents and evaded, really. Or Magic only, power drains, power locks. That's pretty much it that she does, and that's enough for her to be insanely successful and a good champion. And then we have champions like Jubilee, who has 90,000 abilities, but nobody cares about her. We have Psycho Man, who is laughed as arguably the worst champion of 2021, and he has a ton of abilities. So here we are with Scorpion. I do think he has great amount of utility. I do think he has incredibly flexible amount of applications for that utility, which ultimately lands him here. And then on top of it, that insanely high block proficiency is just a cherry on top. Also, one thing that I do like about pretty much all of the champions that I mentioned thus far in the top 7 is also that Scorpion can be extremely gnarly as a defender with his evade mechanic. So that's also just speaking on, the top of him being extremely well-rounded, because he can definitely be a problem on defense if there is not a great counter to him. Right, now top 3. Top 3. I will place at spot number 3 the Cow. I think Cow is just bonkers. I think Cow is the second best neutralized champion in the game, but I do think Cow is the most well-rounded neutralized champion in the game. There are obviously, weaknesses with Cow, and ironically, in some situations, you don't necessarily want Rintrah to be high Sig, for example, because it is a massive difference in your damage capabilities in between your level 1, level 2, and level 3, where level 2 is the money shot, right? The level 2 is the huge amount of burst damage, where for a champion with low crit rate, it is amazing that even if your specials don't crit, they are often powerful enough to easily KO the opponent. And then if they do crit, you feel like you hit a jackpot. I kind of like that with her. Ultimately, the reason why Rintrah is as high as Rintrah is, that's because it's extremely versatile and well-rounded champion. It's one of the best defensive menaces for Battlegrounds as a game mode. Alliance War defensive staple. It's like the biggest health pool in the game, I believe, or the second biggest health pool anyways, up there. And all of that is obviously extremely helpful. And then on top of it all, we do have access to a ton of ruptures, as in a damage over time effect. We have access to a huge amount of damage via the level 2. We have easily controllable and reliable neutralize, which is one of the more powerful Mystic class abilities, which alone, has basically created a subclass of champions that, we look at as a neutralized champions. And a champion that's incredibly potent offensively and defensively, champion that's reliable, and champion that is in fact being used for virtually everything. People use him for some problematic questing fights or some challenge modes. People use Rintrah as one of the most banned champions in Battlegrounds. People use Rintrah in Alliance War, so he has incorporated himself in this game extremely well. I don't think there is a discussion of the quality of this champion. And people have recognized that, and people respond to it, and everybody wants one. If you don't have one, everybody ranks one. If you do have one, and everybody uses one and is happy with one, once you have started using Rintrah. So to me, that speaks of a champion that's successful, well balanced, and deserving of a top 3 spot in this ranking video. Now we are going to move on to spot number 2. Spot number 2, again, we need to talk about these champions, I think, together, because there's a lot of discussion. And there's an ironic interaction between both of them as well, in a sense. We have Galen and we have Hulkling. And I do think it's largely a matter of preference. I will explain why I rank one above the other. But at the same time, when people ask me which one, let's say, to rank for first, or which one to rank for, the answer is you want to rank for both. The question is which one you want to rank for first, or which one needs it more. And my placements are as follows. Galen is second best champion, in my opinion, in 2022. Hulkling is the best champion of 2022. However, when people ask me which one would I rank first, I will say Galen, because he needs it more. Because there is a big difference there's more of a difference, and Galen needs that more because he relies on one big amount of burst. Which means, let's say if you build up Galen to 800 planetary mass as a rank 3 champion and you drop it in Battlegrounds or Alliance War, your rank 3 might not be able to finish off that fight and kill something, and then it complicates the entire fight, and then you need to, start again, build up more health and everything of that nature. With Hulkling, it's not so. If you have a rank 3 Hulkling and you have a rank 4 Hulkling, the only difference is 14% health and attack. That means you're going to have to drop an extra combo. And that does by no means affect which fights Hulkling would or would not be able to finish. It just means that some of the fights will last a few seconds longer. With Galen, it definitely does affect which champions he can burst down, because he often relies on the fact that he can destroy an entire health bar in a single burst of damage, and the burst of damage amount obviously affects which champions he can and cannot burst down. So that's why I do think that Galen needs the rank 4 more. Now, Galen as a champion is a formidable defender. He can definitely pose problems and ideally needs a suitable counter. At the same time, I think overall in the level of fight difficulty, I think Hulkling is the better defender. Obviously, both of them can be countered. Every champion in this game has counters and can be countered by something. But I do think that all things put together, with, let's say, less than ideal counter, you're probably going to do better against Hulkling than you will against Galen. And I do think Hulkling is a riskier defender to go up against. So that was part of the equation, because I do think Hulkling is, slightly better defender. So let's say that's a point to Hulkling. At the same time, both of them are offensively phenomenal, and they do similar things in a way, in completely different manner. Where Hulkling is just brute forcing through his damage without relying on anything else but raw damage. Galen relies on a massive burst of damage in like one big go, occasionally on his incinerates. Now, obviously, Galen does have the benefit of being able to make champions heralds, but let's face it, that herald ability, just like making mutants horsemen of apocalypse, in competitive settings hardly ever is going to come into play. At the moment, the most, used version of this is in order to give extra healing to Hercules in incursions push runs. In general, I don't think the herald system was as powerful as Apocalypse's was, and I do think it's kind of like a bit of a step back, but at the same time it's very good to have type of thing. It definitely is no kind of like diss on him. And Galen is Galen is also, I think, slightly overestimated in his level of power, and that is due to the nature of the game and due to the nature that most of the fights that you do on daily basis are relatively short in duration, and obviously it is visually extremely impressive when you can just nuke down an entire health pool in one big blast. But as soon as fights get slightly longer, Galen is far from the most fastest or effective or damage dealing kind of option in longer fights. That is to say, Galen is pretty much never going to be a Labyrinth of Legends or challenge content type of champion unless there is something that triggers his insanely quick ramp up. All that being said, Galen and Hulkling both are extremely versatile in their offensive uses, which is what I love about both of them. That they can make and take a lot of champions that most other champions cannot do effectively. For instance, Galen can nuke down a thing with no problem. He can nuke down many or most of the champions that directly do not disqualify Galen from doing the fight in the first place. That is to say, he has no dot immunities, for example, therefore you do not want to use Galen against Immortal Abomination because you can die of poison. But as long as you can enter the fight with Galen and he can function relatively normally, you can virtually use him against majority of the champions in the game, which is why he has as much value as he does. He is quite quick in short fights. He's not the fastest. Let's not pretend that he can nuke down faster than, you know, Ghost can or Kitty can in many cases with Liquid Courage Double Edge and stuff like that. But he's very fast into short to medium level fights. But the best thing about him is the way he applies his damage is extremely, extremely versatile. Bypasses a ton of nodes, abilities, and immunities. He does have, obviously, as a Cosmic Champion, quite uniquely Nullify immunity and immunity to basically power modification, which often do come in play. And then there are these matchups like Penny Parker, where he just goes absolutely bonkers and ramps up in mere seconds. So he's crazy. Everybody should seek out this guy. There's a good reason why he makes, you know, certain alliance war lanes irrelevant. Why he is a staple in battlegrounds as an offensive and defensive option. There's a reason why people like him as much as they do, because he's amazing and crazy and insane. And he is well deserving to be. There is a very good reason why we all were worried that he's going to get tuned down. But, that being said, I still place Hulkling above him, because Hulkling does have much of Galen's uniqueness in a way that on his matchups and his versatility across the matchups. Like, he still has immunities to power modification things, and unlike Galen, Hulkling does have much better compatibility with Liquid Courage Double Edge, being able to benefit from that poison immunity. I think that also Hulkling having the poison immunity and shock immunity, you know, is additional nice little bit of a benefit. I do think that Hulkling is, in the shorter fights, somewhat faster, and Hulkling does absolutely qualify as one of the fastest sprinter type of champions in these short fights, where basically level 2 and done, or level 2 and combo and done. I do think that Hulkling, again, has access to his massive damage through block, thanks to Pierce, which is also quite helpful. And, you know, both of them, again, have a lot of matchups similar that they can do extremely well. But ultimately, I do think Hulkling is slightly better, at least for me. For me, it's easier to rely on Hulkling. For me, it's easier to find him used as a defensive champion as well. And he's definitely, in my opinion, scarier as a defensive champion. And even offensively, you do feel more confident entering fights with this guy than, you know, you do with Galen at times, because there's this consistent progress and push forward. So I do think that currently, at the very moment, I think Hulkling is the best champion released this year. He's dominant everywhere. We use him in Alliance War, we use him in Alliance War defense, we use him in Alliance Quest, we use him for questing, we use him for challenge fights, we use him for battlegrounds, we use him for everything. Now, ultimately, I do think that this kind of came down to preference in between Hulkling and Galen. I do, however, debate either one of those two being the best champion of the year. That will be pretty much it for this. It has been quite a long video, so I am going to show you the final rankings here. Here we can see as you see them. So these are all of the 2022 champions ranked now. The next video that I will be releasing is going to be the all 6 classes ranked, and I think that's going to be quite interesting discussion as well. My apologies for taking slightly longer this time around, but these champions are just so amazing that I can't stop myself from complimenting them. And here we are. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will catch you guys later. See ya. Hello there guys, and welcome back to the channel. So we have all the information about